Once upon a time, a visionary high IQ prince in the desert realized that the precious fluid beneath his land wasn't going to carry the kingdom forever the way it once did. So he looked around for answers. Well, maybe he asked Allah for guidance or whatever. The point is, in the end, he had it. The answer to the kingdom's future. The blueprint for the next 1,000 years of prosperity. Well, at least in his mind. Saudi Arabia is a strange place. Even the name gives it away. It's not named after a river or a people or some ancient idea. It's named after a family, the House of Saud. That alone should tell you something. Before it became a country, it wasn't really anything at all. Bits of it were controlled by the Ottomans, other parts by local tribe leaders, all kind of stitched together with no real order. It was messy and fragmented. The only real thing going for it was religion. You had Kaaba in Mecca and the city of Medina, two of the most important sites in Islam. Every year, millions of Muslims make the journey there. That was the main draw, the main reason anyone paid attention to that place at all. Outside of that, there wasn't much. I mean, it's a desert, a harsh one. No rivers, no farmland, no obvious wealth. Back then, the economy ran on money from pilgrims. And when it wasn't the season to visit Allah, people survived on trade, things like spices, incense, textiles. That was it. Not exactly the kind of place you would expect to become one of the most important countries on earth. But turns out, importance is just a matter of timing. To cut a long story short, modern-day Saudi Arabia officially came into existence in 1932 when one man, Ibn Saud, took the land piece by piece, tribe by tribe, until there was nobody left to fight. And from that point onward, him and his descendants, also known as the House of Saud, have ruled the oil kingdom since. But even after the country was added to the world map, nobody really cared. It wasn't until a few years later, in 1938, when the first oil well was discovered in Saudi Arabia, that the world finally started paying attention.
Deep beneath the desert sands near Dhahran, Saudi Arabia has struck oil for the first time in commercial quantities.
The Saudis still call it the prosperity well because that single discovery completely changed the fortune and fate of the country. Like hitting the jackpot and then hitting it again and again. Over the following decades, more oil wells were discovered and the money started pouring in. The same people who once lived in desert tents, riding camels across empty land, were now living in air-conditioned buildings, driving the latest cars the market had to offer. To put it simply, the House of Saud had won a multi-trillion-dollar lottery. And the House of Saud knew exactly how to use this new mountain of wealth. The kingdom built one of the most generous welfare systems on earth. Healthcare, free. Education, free. Fuel so cheap it almost felt illegal. Schools appeared across the country, universities were built from scratch, massive hospitals rose out of the desert. The average Saudi went from living roughly 40 years to over 75 years today. Literacy rates skyrocketed to above 95%. But I have to be honest with you. This wasn't a generous monarchy suddenly wanting the best for its people out of the kindness of its heart. Underneath all the free healthcare, subsidies and shiny new infrastructure, there was an unwritten deal quietly forming between the House of Saud and their Saudi subjects. The monarchy would provide prosperity, comfort and stability, and in return, the Saudis would stay loyal to the crown. No revolutions, no asking too many dangerous questions. As long as the oil money kept flowing and living standards kept rising, most people were more than happy to accept this arrangement. And who could blame them? Not only was Abdul and Muhammad getting generous welfare, subsidies and benefits from the government, a huge chunk of them were also employed by the very same entity. Because unlike most normal countries where the public sector exists mainly to do necessary work, in the oil kingdom the public sector was built around the Saudis themselves. This is a society that has enjoyed the rewards of black gold more than almost anywhere else on earth. I mean, I'm no economist, but I don't think it's a stretch to say the average Saudi probably worries less about finances than Rajesh in India or Jabari in Africa, or even Olivia in the United States. Comfort has become the norm in the oil kingdom, expected. So when a Saudi student graduates university and starts wondering what comes next, The House of Saud already has an answer waiting. Welcome to the oil kingdom's public sector. Why bother grinding away in the private sector for longer hours and less pay when you can go into the public sector? Don't worry, this isn't exactly the kind of place where productivity keeps people awake at night. You can slouch around a little, clock in, clock out, maybe move a few papers from one side of the desk to another if you're feeling ambitious. And even when you're expected to work, the hours are usually shorter than the private sector anyway. And don't stress too much about skills or experience. I'm sure they'll find some way to squeeze you in. All that you really need to prove is that you're a Saudi. In essence, the Saudi public sector is designed to keep the population busy, comfortable, and supplied with a steady paycheck. And the results of all this, about 2/3 of working Saudis are employed by the public sector. This has led to the oil kingdom spending well over $130 billion on salaries, pensions, and benefits. That's nearly half of the state's budget. Think about that for a second. Half of the budget of one of the richest countries on earth, essentially functioning as a giant trust fund to keep most of the population busy enough not to revolt. But you might be wondering, if 2/3 of the working population is sitting in the public sector, then who's actually working the other jobs? You know, like who's at the local car wash, who's flipping burgers at McDonald's, who's driving the taxis, stocking shelves, pouring concrete in the 45-degree heat, because surely there aren't enough Saudis left to do all that. And you'd be right, there aren't exactly masses of Saudis lining up for those kind of jobs, the way they line up at Starbucks. And that's why the House of Saud needed someone else to do those unglamorous jobs. But fortunately for them, there's no shortage of poverty in many parts of the world. Places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sudan, Philippines, and many others. For decades, ever since the oil money started flowing in, millions of workers from poorer countries have been brought into the oil kingdom to do the not so glamorous jobs most locals don't really want to do. Construction, cleaning, delivery driving, restaurants, domestic work, maintenance. These migrants are brought in under something called the kafala system, or as some critics like to call it, modern slavery.
The word kafala means sponsorship. It's a system used across Gulf nations to regulate foreign labor. Under this system, every migrant worker is tied to a local sponsor who wields significant control over their employment and movement.
Now, to be fair, tying foreign workers to employers isn't exactly unique to Saudi Arabia. Many countries have some sort of a worker visa system where your right to stay depends on your job. But in the oil kingdom, your boss has a lot more leverage. Don't like your job laying tarmac in 45-degree desert heat and want to switch employers? Well, first you need permission from the very person you're trying to get away from. Want to leave the country and go home? That might also depend whether your boss feels like handing your passport back. It takes no genius to realize this system was abused. Workers trapped in bad conditions, passports confiscated, delayed wages, long hours, little leverage. But then again, there's a reason why over 13 million migrant workers are still in Saudi Arabia, and that's economics. Because the same exact work they do in Saudi Arabia would often pay far less back home. Just like the French saying goes, a hungry belly has no ears. It was a choice between struggle at home or struggle abroad with slightly better pay. All those movies you've seen about some dystopian future where society runs on inequality with a comfortable upper class pretending not to notice, and you sitting there thinking it's a bit exaggerated. Well, I hate to break it to you, that future has already passed, at least in the Gulf. There are basically two realities in the Gulf, and which one you experience depends largely on your passport. If you're a Gulf citizen, life is generally very comfortable. Free education, healthcare, subsidies on fuel and housing, and of course, a nice comfy government job waiting somewhere down the line. But if you happen to be born in parts of Africa or South Asia, well, more than likely, your reality looks very different. You're sharing a cramped room with 6 other people, sleeping on bunk beds, waking up before sunrise to work overtime in the brutal heat. Maybe you're pouring concrete for the latest futuristic skyscraper they just announced to investors. Maybe you're a personal driver for one of the rich families. Or maybe you're at the local Starbucks, making frappuccinos for Nepo babies, discussing the future of innovation. Either way, I'm not trying to be cruel here by saying nobody's looking at your life with envy. But this dystopian divide inside the oil kingdom was perfectly acceptable to the House of Saud. Sure, every now and then you would get those pesky human rights groups highlighting another incident from the kingdom. Maybe a story about a maid from the Philippines being abused by a wealthy family. Maybe some poor bloke from India collapsed from heat stroke on a construction site while building the next shiny new mega project in the desert. But to the House of Saud, that wasn't the priority. Because as long as the Saudi population stayed comfortable, loyal and politically quiet, their rule over the oil kingdom remained secure. That's what matters to them. For decades, life was going well in the oil kingdom, at least for the Saudis. Oil flowed out of the desert and in exchange, billions of dollars poured in. That was until something happened.
The world hasn't seen such a drop.
The Wall Street Journal looks at plunging oil prices.
The price of US oil has fallen below the symbolic threshold of $50.
In 2014, oil prices collapsed. Oil that had once sold for around 110 barrels suddenly dropped hard, falling well below $100 and at points crashing towards the 30 range. And there was a few reasons for this tragedy. The Gulf states were pumping huge amounts of oil into the market, while at the same time, Uncle Sam had started guzzling his own oil thanks to the American shale boom. But worse for the Saudis, Uncle Sam didn't just stop buying as much oil. Cutting straight into the Saudi oil revenue pie, he started exporting American oil onto the global market. And on top of that, the world was slowly waking up to climate change and starting to take it more seriously. Electric cars, renewables, cutting fossil fuel use, all of it slowly eating into the long-term demand for oil. To say the least, this was a problem for the House of Saud. You see, oil made up 40% of the country's GDP and more than 80% of government revenue. The whole Saudi system, subsidies, welfare, public sector jobs, all of it ran on the oil money. But now the numbers stopped looking so pretty. In 2015, the oil kingdom recorded a budget deficit approaching $100 billion. The following year, another massive deficit, somewhere around $80 billion. In simple terms, the House of Saud was spending far more than it was bringing in. And if that trend continued, this wasn't just an economic problem anymore. It became existential because the entire Saudi contract depended on the monarchy being able to keep people comfortable. But comfort costs money, a lot of money. And this wasn't the same Saudi Arabia from the old days anymore either. Back when the kingdom first struck oil, there were only a few million Saudis to look after. But now, the population had exploded to well over 30 million. Meaning there were far more mouths to feed, while the oil money itself was dwindling. This terrified the monarchy, because a few years back, they had already seen what happened during the Arab Spring in their own backyard. They saw strong men who once ruled over their kingdoms for decades suddenly get kicked out and in some cases, unalived. At the time, Saudi Arabia probably survived partly because it still had enough oil wealth to keep the population docile. But what happens when you tell a crackhead there's no more crack? What happens when you tell a spoiled kid they're not getting any more candy? They throw a tantrum. And if 30 million people start throwing that tantrum inside the oil kingdom, that becomes very dangerous for the monarchy. To put it simply, the House of Saud needed to act fast. They had to somehow diversify away from oil before the whole system started to collapse. And stepping forward as the man to save the day was Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of the oil kingdom. Now there's a lot to say about MBS, the Machiavellian maneuvers he pulled to climb to power, the way he seems to view himself as some kind of an enlightened reformer, but that's probably for another video. For the House of Saud, MBS arrived at the perfect time. Finally, there was someone who didn't look like he was about to have a stroke mid-speech. Someone young, ambitious, and ruthless enough to actually try something. So what exactly was MBS's big plan? Now you would think that in a country that's basically a giant desert with oil and religion the only two things going for it, the very high IQ visionary MBS would probably look at the population itself and think, maybe these people are the key to diversification, because aside from oil, the kingdom actually does have one massive advantage, and that is youth. The median age in Saudi Arabia is around 30, and compared to a lot of developed countries, the kingdom has a massive young population. And if you manage that properly, young people can become economic gold mines. I mean, take a look at Singapore or South Korea. They've already proved that. So naturally, you would assume the plan would be pretty straightforward. Upskill the population, push education, build technical skills. But then you might be wondering, wait, didn't you say earlier that the Saudi population is already educated? Well, technically yes, on paper, but being educated and actually being useful in a modern economy are very two different things. A person can collect degrees like Pokemon cards and still completely freeze the moment they face a real world problem. And that's been one of the issues inside the oil kingdom. The Saudi education system traditionally focused heavily on memorization. Pass the exam, repeat the information, move on. A lot less focus were put on things like creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, the stuff that actually matters in the real world. But maybe that wasn't entirely by accident, because when populations start thinking too critically, they also start asking critical questions, which isn't exactly ideal for a hereditary monarchy. But I digress. In the oil kingdom, students often end up studying to survive exams rather than genuinely learning how to build, innovate, or challenge ideas. And despite all the money thrown at education, the system still struggled with poorly trained teachers, weak science and technical teaching, and way too much focus on religious studies over the practical skills needed for a modern economy. In the past, this became a real problem when the government actually started trying to push these air-conditioned aristocrats into the private sector. The kingdom had introduced quotas, forcing foreign companies to hire more Saudi nationals, but many of these foreign employers immediately started complaining about the lack of practical skills among forced hirees. Years of rote learning and heavy religious induction hadn't exactly prepared these people for the modern job market. But aside from that, there's a bigger issue at hand. You see, this kind of education system doesn't really produce much innovation either, which is a bit of a problem when you're trying to build a futuristic post-oil economy. And I mean, the numbers tell the story. Between 1977 and 2010, Saudi Arabia registered only 382 patents in the United States. 382. That's less than 12 patents a year. Meanwhile, South Korea registered over 84,000 during the same period, while the oil kingdom's Jewish neighbors, with barely any resources, managed over 20,000. While Israel became known as the startup nation, with thousands of startups mainly in the tech sector contributing a huge chunk to the economy, the Saudis, despite their wealth during this time, have produced nothing but oil. I mean, think of a globally recognized Saudi company outside of oil. I bet nothing really comes to mind. And if any company does, it's probably Al Baik, Saudi Arabia's beloved fried chicken chain. Now look guys, I'm no genius, but I don't think a glorified KFC chain is going to exactly replace billions in oil revenue anytime soon. But then again, if you really want startups popping left and right and center, just building shiny office towers in the desert, opening a few universities, or throwing billions at venture capital funds isn't enough. A real startup ecosystem needs a culture behind it. You need people to take risks, challenge authority, break the status quo. You need a society that rewards merit more than hierarchy. Now good luck finding that inside an authoritarian monarchy. In the oil kingdom and pretty much the wider Arab world, society traditionally leans far more towards seniority, connections and conformity than raw merit or rebellious innovation. In a society where stability is valued above everything else, startup culture doesn't exactly thrive. But maybe MBS, the enlightened reformer that he is, had other plans. Maybe he understood if you actually want to diversify an economy, you can't just build tech hubs in the desert and hope for the best. Maybe the country itself had to change too. Maybe loosening social restrictions in a country not exactly known for individual freedoms would help. Maybe allowing women greater freedoms and participation in society would boost the economy. Maybe improving the kingdom's image abroad would attract more tourism and foreign investment. Because the way it goes, you don't diversify an economy just by signing a few economic laws and calling it a day. It spills into culture, education, social norms, into how people think, work, innovate, and live. And what's crazy is that Saudi Arabia actually has the capacity to pull something like this off. You see, even after the oil crash, the Saudis still had an absurd amount of money saved for a rainy day through their piggy bank, also known as the Public Investment Fund. We are talking well over $1 trillion. Think about that for a second. Most countries would need decades to push through the kind of deep structural changes needed to transform their economy. But the Saudis, they had enough money to brute force huge parts of it far faster than almost anywhere else on earth. That is, if they were actually willing to put in the real work. But then again, maybe I'm just chatting complete nonsense. After all, I'm just some guy making a YouTube video. Surely the visionary reformer that MBS is knows a thing or two about diversification. I mean, this is the crown prince of the oil kingdom, the next in line to the throne. Not only that, he is also in charge of the oil kingdom's piggy bank and is the head of the Council of Economic and Developmental Affairs, the actual government body responsible for diversification. Surely the House of Saud didn't pick this young prince out of the hundreds floating around for no reason. They must have seen something in him, his intelligence, his merit, his limitless vision. So then, what exactly was MBS's grand plan? Well, you and I probably already know what his grand vision is by now. The enlightened MBS decided it was time to turn the oil kingdom, a country mostly known internationally for oil and human rights controversies, into a global tourist hotspot. Absolutely terrific. So how exactly is he planning to pull that off? Well, the crown jewel of Vision 2030 is the NEOM project, a gigantic futuristic tourist and business region being built in the northwest of the oil kingdom. This includes Torgina, which is basically a ski resort being built in the desert. Yes, a snow ski resort in the desert. Now, maybe I've been living under a rock and didn't realize global warming had somehow wiped out the Alps in Europe and the ski resorts of North America, because apparently the logical next step for skiers is to fly halfway across the world to the middle of a desert instead of just going to the places that already exist, have snow, and weren't built on sand. How else would it make sense to build a $38 billion ski resort in the desert? I mean, surely the geniuses over at the Saudi Council of Economic and Developmental Affairs did the cost-benefit analysis and said, yeah, this is a terrific idea. And then there's the Oxygon. No, I don't mean MBS is building a giant MMA arena in the desert, at least not yet. What I mean is they're building a floating industrial complex shaped like, you guessed it, an octagon. And that's because normal shaped industrial zones no longer qualify for the aesthetics of the future. Now, aside from the floating part, this isn't meant to be some ordinary industrial area sitting on the outskirts of town. No, this thing is supposed to house one of the world's largest ports, automated factories, green hydrogen production, research centers, AI-driven logistics, basically every futuristic buzzword you can squeeze into a PowerPoint presentation. And the Saudis are hoping that if they throw enough money at tech and logistics, in this case tens of billions of dollars, the oil kingdom can somehow become the next great global tech and logistics superpower. Now, with the amount of money the Saudis are throwing at this stuff, I have to admit, guys, maybe I was wrong. Maybe all you really need to build a Silicon Valley style innovation hub is money. Tons of it, and all those other things people talk about: culture, risk-taking, competition, talent, creativity. Maybe those are words for fools like me. Clearly, if you build enough futuristic buildings in the desert, innovation will simply sprout out naturally like lettuce from the ground. I mean, MBS is obviously a genius visionary. He would know better than me. All you need is money. Lots of it, which also explains why places like Europe, China and Russia have struggled to compete with Silicon Valley. Clearly they don't have enough moolah, not enough cash, but now the tech bros in Silicon Valley better pull their socks up, because our guy MBS is about to bring them some serious competition. And then of course there is The Line.
I told the team, how about if we take that 2 kilo and we flip it to 2 towers to the whole line? Does that gonna work? It's gonna be massive.
A planned 170 kilometers slab of concrete cutting straight through mountains and desert. The idea is to turn this giant wall in the desert into a futuristic linear city powered entirely by renewable energy. Now, I'm sure, like many of you probably feel already, the world isn't exactly turning into the kind of place you're excited to bring children into. You've got constant wars, inflation eating away at people's savings, disease popping up every few years, and of course, the housing crisis. Young people can barely afford homes, cities are overcrowded, and infrastructure is struggling to keep up. So naturally, MBS, the visionary, decided to help make the world a better place for mine and your children by building giant futuristic homes in the desert so people can finally have a place to live. And he clearly understands exactly what the average young family dreams of when putting down a mortgage for their first home, living stacked on top of each other inside a giant straight line in the middle of a harsh desert. But don't worry, the shape of the city is actually part of the genius. You will supposedly be able to reach anywhere inside the city within minutes thanks to high-speed transport. No roads, no cars, just trains shooting through a giant concrete corridor like some futuristic ant farm. And of course, because every city now needs one, there'll also be an AI system monitoring and optimizing daily life for residents. Yes, an AI quietly observing your behavior and movements in order to improve your quality of life. Very comforting. And if you somehow end up unemployed living in this futuristic desert corridor, don't panic, my friend, because one proposed idea involves residents potentially earning money from the data they provide to the AI overlord. Truly the dream, don't you think so? A giant futuristic dune-style megacity in the desert, humans stacked into mirrored walls, watched over by an AI overlord that pays you in exchange for your behavioral data. What a time to be alive. But if one giant futuristic desert city wasn't enough, there's also Qiddiya. The project includes a Six Flags Qiddiya City theme park for your kids. And if dragging your kids around roller coasters in the desert heat ends up in a heat stroke, don't worry, our Lord and Savior MBS is also building the Aqua Arabia water park right next to it, so you can cool off there. But maybe you're not a ski resort type of guy, and maybe flying all the way to the oil kingdom for a theme park isn't really your thing either. Well, don't worry, Qiddiya is also planning a purpose-built Formula 1 racing circuit, hoping to lure all the racing fans to the oil kingdom. And speaking of F1, the oil kingdom is also planning to make their country into a major sports destination, and the way they are planning to do that is the same way they plan to become a tech superpower, by throwing money at it. Recently, the Saudis have been on a spending spree, offering gigantic contracts to famous footballers willing to play in the Saudi League. Now let's be honest here, any world-class footballer in their absolute prime is probably not dreaming about playing in the Saudi League. And the reason is pretty simple. If you ask any football fan what league they actually sit down and watch every week, the Saudi League probably isn't anywhere near the top of that list. And the players themselves, well, they are already rich and there's nothing else the Saudi League has to offer. But things change once players start getting older. As they move past their peak, the big European clubs stop seeing them as worth the same kind of money. Demands drop, but those massive contracts to play in the desert start looking a lot more tempting. And that's how you end up with names like Cristiano Ronaldo, Neymar and Karim Benzema all ending up in the Saudi League after their peak years. The Saudis have also been trying to buy influence directly inside major football leagues themselves. And they actually managed to do that by buying Newcastle United, a football club playing in the Premier League, which is the biggest football league on the planet. And while they're at it, the Oil Kingdom has also locked in the rights to host the 2034 FIFA World Cup. But it's not just football either. The Saudis have been throwing money into golf for a time now. They created Live Golf to rival the famous PGA Tour, and they've also struck deal with the WWE to host massive wrestling events in the Oil Kingdom alongside major boxing matches as well. But it doesn't stop with physical sports. The Oil Kingdom has also gone heavily into esports and gaming. The Saudis are planning to throw more than $38 billion into gaming by buying stakes in gaming companies, hosting global esports events, investing in major publishers, and funding local game studios. And there are plenty of other projects under Vision 2030 umbrella that I won't get into here, but you get the picture. MBS looked around and said, the plan is to turn the Oil Kingdom into the next Dubai, just on a larger scale. That's Vision 2030 in a nutshell. You see, aside from hosting the OG Makkah, where millions of Muslims already travel for pilgrimage, the idea is to build a second Makkah of sorts, but for entertainment, tourism, tech, and innovation. A destination the world can fly into for everything at once. Sounds great on paper, but wanting something and actually pulling it off are two very different things. So how is Vision 2030 actually going so far? Well, it is true that right now, all across the oil kingdom, massive construction work is taking place. But while bricks are being laid and steel bolted together in the desert heat to fulfill the dreams of the Tsar of the oil kingdom, there are also repeated reports that thousands of workers, the ones from Africa and South Asia, have lost their lives in the process. Workplace accidents aren't exactly rare in the oil kingdom, but what critics often point out is that compared to many developed countries, migrant workers and their families often end up with very little compensation and not a lot of clarity when something serious happens. In some cases, critics argue that the official reports sent back through embassies about cases of death are kept pretty vague, things like natural causes, when in fact the poor bloke might have been electrocuted to death. But while all of that sits in the background, construction doesn't slow down, at least not due to safety concerns. The buildings just keep getting bigger while artificial skylines appear in the desert. And it's not just safety issues that fail to slow down these mega projects. If you happen to be some poor shepherd living in a remote village in the Saudi desert and your land sits in the path of a planned development, like the dune-style city, The Line, then tough luck. There's no town hall meeting you can attend to protest, because in the oil kingdom, you are forced to relocate, and if you protest, then allegedly you can spend the rest of your days in a Saudi prison or worse. Reportedly, thousands of Saudis have been forced to abandon their homes, and many have died to make way for the new vision for the desert. These sorts of reports anywhere else would usually trigger investigations. At the very least, someone would be forced to answer uncomfortable questions. But in the oil kingdom, that's not really how it goes. Why waste your time acknowledging these issues when you can hire an international PR firm talking about how lovely your vision is? It's not like a poor migrant worker's life is of value anyway, at least when compared to the brilliant vision 2030. But if safety or humanitarian concerns don't really slow things down, then money definitely does, and lately that's been a problem for the Saudis. Reports have suggested that a number of Vision 2030 mega projects have been scaled back, delayed, or quietly reworked behind the scenes. That includes The Line, which now looks less like a 170-kilometer futuristic megacity and more like a much smaller phase development. And I'm sorry to all the ski resort enthusiasts, but construction on Torjina has also reportedly been delayed. Saudi Arabia had hoped to host the Asian Winter Games there, but those plans have since been moved elsewhere, leaving the project's timeline looking less certain than originally promised. Part of the reason is that even though MBS has its hands on the giant Saudi piggy bank, the whole plan still depends on one thing the kingdom can't fully escape from, and that, of course, is oil. When oil prices go up, everyone starts acting like the future is arriving tomorrow, but when prices drop, the futuristic roadmap looks a bit distant. Now, to be fair, nobody in their right mind really expected all of this to be finished on time by 2030. Probably not even our guy, MBS. But regardless of when these mega projects get finished, in 2030, 2040, or sometime before the sun explodes, the real question is, are the Saudis actually on the right track to diversification? Because the entire strategy basically boils down to this: get tourists, sports fans, video game geeks, finance and tech bros to fly into the oil kingdom and spend money. But there's just one slight problem. The oil kingdom isn't exactly known for democracy, freedom of speech, or liberal values. When most people hear the word Saudi Arabia, the first things that usually come to mind aren't exactly innovation or tourism resorts. Rather, it's probably oil, royal wealth, and human rights controversies. This is not exactly the kind of branding most tourist destinations dream of having. And despite how MBS likes to present himself internationally as this bold, young reformer dragging the kingdom into the future, his little foreign policy adventures haven't exactly done wonders for the country's image either. I mean, think about the Yemen war and the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, which critics say was ordered by the enlightened reformer himself. But then again, maybe I'm just being too pessimistic. Maybe MBS really is the visionary genius he sees in the mirror every morning. Maybe if you build giant cities in the desert, tourists will simply spawn naturally, like NPCs loading into a video game. But luckily for us, we don't have to rub a crystal ball to get glimpses of the future, because we can already take a sneak peek at how people around the world are reacting to Vision 2030. And what better way to judge people's reaction to the Saudi tourism push than by looking at one of the biggest cultural war flashpoints from last year, the Riyadh Comedy Festival. Now, after years of headlines involving wars, executions, and human rights criticism, the Saudis probably looked at their global image and thought, you know what this kingdom needs? A few jokes. And so, from the palace of MBS came the brilliant idea that the Oil Kingdom would host its first major comedy festival. But this wasn't going to be some depressing open mic night at your local pub with a guy named Steve talking about his divorce for 7 minutes. No. This was going to be huge. Big names were invited: David Chappell, Kevin Hart, Bill Burr, Louis C.K. and others. For a moment, it genuinely looked like the Saudis might pull off one of the biggest comedy events in years. But there was just one small problem. Some comedians refused to go because of the Oil Kingdom's brand image. Turns out, years of human rights controversies, restrictions on speech, and authoritarian policies are slightly difficult to wash away just by putting a microphone on stage and dimming the lights. Some comedians that were too woke, like David Cross and Mark Maron, chose not to attend. But luckily for the Saudis, there were plenty of comedians willing to look past minor inconveniences like modern slavery or state authorized murder if the check was large enough. I mean, I'm not blaming them. If someone offered me a few $100,000 to tell jokes in an air-conditioned palace, I'd probably start packing my bags too. But that's not really the point here. The point is that the Saudis thought they could slightly comedy wash the kingdom's image, but instead, the whole thing just reminded people why the image was controversial in the first place, especially after reports surfaced that comedians were expected to avoid certain topics. You know, tiny little subjects like the royal family, religion, the legal system, and human rights. And that's why a few comedians who couldn't really keep their mouths in check ahead of the festival were quietly pulled from the lineup. People like Tim Dillon, who couldn't keep his mouth shut and chose to utter the words slavery and Saudi Arabia in the same sentence.
And I said, I was being positive about it. I was defending them. I said, I was defending them for having slaves.
The Riyadh Comedy Festival ended up being a huge controversy in the comedy world. And that's kind of been the story with almost everything the Saudis have been doing lately. Whether it's hosting WWE events or getting Mr. Beast to open up a temporary theme park in the desert, it always ends up in some controversy. Meanwhile, the Saudis, like with pretty much any problem they've run into, have just thrown money at it and hope the problem sorts itself out. And I mean, sure, money can buy the event, money can buy the celebrity, money can even buy people's silence, but it can't instantly buy people's perception of your country. And the Saudis don't exactly make the problem easy for themselves either. Take the early WWE events in the Oil Kingdom for example. At first, women straight up weren't allowed to wrestle. Then, after the backlash became impossible to ignore, the Saudis finally allowed it, but only if the women wrestlers were covered up to fit the Saudi standards. And this is the dilemma the Saudis are stuck in. You see, while the Saudis have been fortunate enough to have an abundance of oil under their feet, they've also been dealing with the misery of being a deeply religious society. If you suddenly start allowing things conservative Saudis see as too Western or un-Islamic, you risk the wrath of bearded men that don't exactly want the Oil Kingdom turning into Las Vegas with minarets. But at the same time, if you keep everything ultra strict and heavily controlled, then good luck trying to become the global tourist paradise MBS has wet dreams about. And that's because the average Western tourist isn't exactly flying halfway across the world for an Islamically monitored fun experience. But the Saudis seem to think they can somehow perfectly balance both worlds. Keep the bearded guys praying 5 times a day at the local mosque happy, while also satisfying the divorced middle-aged American tourists looking for cocktails, concerts, and a wild vacation. Yeah, good luck with that. And so, here we are. MBS is throwing absolutely everything at turning the Oil Kingdom into a global tourist destination. Concerts, sporting events, influencers, celebrities. But no matter how many events get hosted or how many billions are spent on rebranding, the problem doesn't go away. And the problem is that the world remembers, the internet remembers. The oil kingdom's human rights reputation keeps following it around like a bad smell that refuses to leave the room. Sports washing, comedy washing, culture washing, nothing seems to be helping. In fact, it all just loops back around again. Every new event brings fresh attention brings controversy, and controversy means the Saudis have to go right back to try to rebrand themselves all over again. Now, to be fair, MBS has actually pushed some reforms, trying a bit to make the oil kingdom less intolerable. Women can drive now. The religious police don't roam around malls and public spaces like star troopers with beards. Cinemas and concerts have opened up. Parts of the kafala system have loosened. And compared to what the oil kingdom looked like a decade ago, yes, some things have changed. But despite all that, the oil kingdom still ranks among the worst countries on earth in silly little things like modern slavery, still has one of the worst press freedom records in the world, and continues to get constantly poked around by groups like Amnesty International over its human rights record. But even if by some miracle Saudi Arabia's reputation wasn't the problem, somebody probably should have told our boy MBS that the world only has so much appetite for luxury tourist playgrounds in the desert. We already have Dubai, and judging by how people talk about Dubai these days, even that novelty is starting to wear off. Because eventually the giant malls, luxury hotels, influencer parties, and artificial islands stop feeling futuristic and start feeling normal. Once the shiny Vision 2030 mega projects are actually built, then what? Who exactly is going to live in the line with an AI overlord? Who will regularly fly out to Qadiyah? Sure, people will visit at first. Humans love shiny new toys, but shiny new toys lose their appeal pretty fast. MBS seems obsessed with turning the oil kingdom into Dubai because maybe it worked for Dubai. But the problem is Dubai is a tiny dot on the world map with a lot less mouths to feed, a lot less people to keep docile. On the other hand, the oil kingdom has over 30 million mouths to feed. MBS thinks that if he builds enough mega projects, then enough money will eventually just appear around naturally, which he can then use to keep his Saudi subjects happy and docile. But maybe Vision 2030 is partly the product of MBS's subconscious. You see, there's something called the edifice complex. The idea is that powerful rulers like MBS, the kind that don't really have to worry too much about elections, opposition parties, or annoying democratic checks and balances, become obsessed with giant physical projects. Massive towers, gigantic cities, mega projects so huge they can be seen from space. Because to people like that, these projects aren't just buildings, they're legacy projects, or in other words, ego projects. Proof of power cast into concrete and steel. Because when you look at things like a 170-kilometer line cutting through desert or giant futuristic leisure cities popping up out of nowhere, you do start wondering if maybe part of this is MBS trying to carve himself into history. Like somewhere deep in his subconscious, there's a voice saying,
"Centuries from now, people will look at these structures and remember my name, the one and only, the enlightened reformer, the visionary prince who built sci-fi cities in the middle of the desert while the rest of the world argued on X."
But maybe MBS genuinely believes in the philosophy of, if you build it, they will come. Why spend your time slowly building up mundane things like education systems, critical thinking, problem-solving skills, innovation culture, when you can just fast forward the whole thing by building giant research labs, futuristic campuses, and shiny tech hubs in the middle of a desert? And from that perspective, the plan isn't really about rebuilding the population from the ground up, it's more about importing the top talent instead. Bring in scientists, tech bros, all the nerds from around the world, and have them build the future for the oil kingdom. Sort of like the poor migrants they bring in to babysit the Saudi populace, except this time with better pay and some human dignity. But is this really how you diversify an entire country? Is this sustainable? Because if it was just a money problem, then I'm sure China or Singapore would have built the next Silicon Valley already. But they haven't, and that's what MBS can't seem to comprehend. It goes beyond just throwing money at tech. It cuts into how people actually think, how they solve problems, how they handle failure, how comfortable they are with uncertainty. And that kind of shift isn't surface level, it's deep work. The slow kind the kind that has to run through schools, institutions, and culture. And in theory, the Saudis could have gone down that route if they really wanted to. I mean, I'm no expert, but imagine taking a fraction of that oil wealth, say $100 billion, and dumping it into education alone. Not just new buildings or glossy universities, but full system redesign. Curriculums rebuilt from scratch, less memorization, more problem solving. Less repeat this for exam, more figure this out even if it breaks your brain a little. Kids learning to code at 12 instead of just learning to comply. Entrepreneurship actually encouraged, not just mentioned in speeches, with grants, legal protection, and a bit of tolerance for failure baked into the system. Slowly building a society that's less afraid of risk, less allergic to uncertainty, less locked into this is how it's always been done. But I guess that's the hard path. I mean, forget innovation or building a startup nation. Our boy MBS has a more basic problem: getting his Saudi subjects out of the comfort of the public sector and into the private economy. Because right now, a lot of Saudis would still rather take the stable government job over stepping into the private sector where performance actually matters and there's a bit less room to coast. And even though things have slightly improved, that heavy reliance on government jobs is still very much a thing. Perhaps I've been too mean to MBS. Maybe part of the problem is most of the Saudis themselves. At some point, the Saudis need to realize that times have changed now, and the oil money or the Saudi piggy bank won't carry them forever if they don't pull their socks up and put in real work. If you want Saudi Arabia to be great again, you have to change with the times.